In 1935, Franklin Roosevelt signed the Rural Electrification Act and turned the United States into a superpower. In 2026, a private company is asking America to do it again. Except this time, the company asking is the one that needs the electricity. The question isn't whether OpenAI's proposal is good policy. The question is, what happens to a country, to your country, if it says yes? And what happens if it says no? The stakes are not theoretical. They will determine who controls the most valuable economic asset of the 21st century, how national wealth gets distributed in a post-labor economy, and whether the United States remains the dominant technological power on Earth, or cedes that position within a decade. To understand what OpenAI is really proposing, you need to understand the bottleneck. For the last 18 months, the single greatest constraint on artificial intelligence development has not been algorithms. It has not been talent. It has not been capital. God knows there's capital. The constraint is energy. Raw, physical, electrons moving through copper energy. Training a frontier AI model today consumes as much electricity as a small city. Running inference, the process of actually using these models at scale, consumes even more. McKinsey estimates that US data center electricity demand could reach 606 terawatt-hours by 2030. That's roughly 12% of total US electricity consumption, up from about 4% today. Some estimates run higher. The American grid was not built for this. It was built for an industrial economy that peaked in the 1970s and a services economy that kept demand roughly flat for 20 years. Now, suddenly, demand is surging, and the grid is groaning. OpenAI knows this. Every major AI lab knows this. And so in early April 2026, OpenAI released a policy framework that, on its surface, reads like a piece of progressive economic thinking. Two core proposals. First, a massive build-out and modernization of the US electric grid, with streamlined permitting, expanded generation capacity, including nuclear, and a reimagined transmission network. Second, a public wealth fund, seeded by AI-driven economic gains designed to distribute the prosperity of the AI era broadly across the American population. Sounds noble. Sounds forward-thinking. Now let's decode it. Let's start with the grid proposal. OpenAI is not an energy company. It doesn't build power plants. It doesn't string transmission lines. So why is it lobbying for grid expansion? Because OpenAI's entire business model, its $157 billion valuation, its enterprise contracts, its API revenue, its partnership with Microsoft, depends on the ability to scale compute. And compute requires power. Abundant, cheap, reliable power. Right now, new data center projects in Virginia, Texas, and the Midwest are being delayed, sometimes by years, because the local grid cannot support them. OpenAI's competitors face the same problem. Google has signed nuclear power agreements. Amazon has purchased a data center campus directly adjacent to a nuclear plant in Pennsylvania. Meta is scouring the globe for energy assets. So when OpenAI proposes a national grid build-out, it is proposing that the American taxpayer subsidize the single most critical input for OpenAI's private business. This is not inherently wrong. The interstate highway system subsidized the auto industry. The internet backbone subsidized Silicon Valley. But let's be precise about what's happening. This is an infrastructure play dressed as public policy. Now, the wealth fund. This is the more interesting and more dangerous proposal. The logic goes like this. AI will generate enormous economic value. It will also displace enormous numbers of workers. A public wealth fund, funded by some share of AI-generated profits, through taxation, equity stakes, or licensing fees, would redistribute that value to ordinary citizens. Think of it as Alaska's permanent fund, but for the entire country, funded not by oil, but by intelligence. Sam Altman has floated versions of this idea since at least 2021. What's different now is the context. Unemployment in AI-exposed white-collar sectors is ticking upward. Legal services, financial analysis, software development, content creation, all showing measurable labor compression. The political temperature is rising. Congressional hearings on AI labor displacement have tripled in frequency since 2024. OpenAI is reading the room, and it's making a calculated bet. If displacement is coming regardless, it is better to be the company that proposed the solution than the company that caused the problem. This is classic strategic framing. Define the terms of the debate before your opponents do. Let's think about the other players. China. Beijing is watching this closely. China's State Grid Corporation is already the largest utility company on Earth. China has been building ultra-high voltage transmission lines for over a decade, the kind of infrastructure the US is only now discussing. If the US delays its grid build-out, the compute advantage shifts east. OpenAI knows this, and it's weaponizing the argument. Fund our infrastructure or lose the AI race. The EU. Brussels has taken a regulatory-first approach to AI. The AI Act is in force. But Europe has no frontier model competitor to OpenAI, no Anthropic, no Google DeepMind operating at the same scale on European soil. If the US builds the grid and funds the ecosystem, Europe falls further behind, becoming a consumer of American AI, not a producer. This has profound implications for European strategic autonomy. Microsoft, OpenAI's largest backer and most critical partner. Microsoft has already committed over $80 billion in AI infrastructure spending for fiscal year 2025 alone. A government-subsidized grid build-out would dramatically reduce Microsoft's marginal cost of compute. Every dollar the taxpayer spends on transmission lines is a dollar Microsoft doesn't have to spend on power purchase agreements. NVIDIA. Every new data center needs chips. Jensen Huang's company is already the most valuable on Earth. A national grid expansion is functionally a demand guarantee for NVIDIA's next 3 generations of hardware. So who actually benefits? Follow the money. If this proposal, or something like it, becomes law, the primary beneficiaries are the 5 or 6 companies building frontier AI models, the semiconductor manufacturers supplying them, the energy companies contracted to build new generation capacity, and, eventually, theoretically, partially, the American public through the wealth fund. The question is the ratio. How much value flows to the builders versus the public, and who sets that ratio? Because the entity proposing the fund is the same entity generating the taxable gains. That's a structural conflict of interest that no one in Washington is adequately discussing. Now, let's walk through the scenarios. Scenario A, the most likely path. Congress, gridlocked as it is, does not pass a comprehensive AI infrastructure bill in 2026, but elements of the proposal get absorbed into existing legislation. Permitting reform for energy projects, already bipartisan, accelerates. The Department of Energy expands loan guarantees for AI-adjacent power generation. A few pilot wealth fund programs emerge at the state level, California perhaps, or a coalition of tech-heavy states. OpenAI gets part of what it wants: faster power, political goodwill, and the narrative framing of a responsible actor. The wealth fund remains aspirational. Workers displaced by AI fall into existing and inadequate safety nets. The gap between AI capital owners and everyone else widens, slowly, then quickly. Scenario B, the black swan. Imagine this: the grid build-out happens, trillions flow into energy infrastructure, AI scales massively, and then a breakthrough in artificial general intelligence arrives faster than anyone modeled. Not 2030, not 2028, sooner. The wealth fund isn't operational yet. The political frameworks aren't in place. Displacement hits not 10% of white-collar jobs, but 40% across a 5-year window. The public realizes that the infrastructure they funded enabled the very system that replaced them, and the wealth fund meant to compensate them was never built. The political backlash isn't a policy debate, it's a legitimacy crisis. Think less New Deal. Think more Luddite rebellion, but with 21st century communication tools and a population that was promised a share of the gains. Here's what keeps me up at night about this story. OpenAI's proposal is, in many ways, correct. The grid does need to be rebuilt. Wealth concentration from AI is the defining economic challenge of this generation. A public fund is a reasonable mechanism. But the entity making the proposal is not a government. It is not a non-profit. It is not a neutral policy institute. It is the single most valuable private AI company on Earth, proposing that the state build the infrastructure it needs, while simultaneously offering to let the public share in the wealth it generates. On terms, it will help define. This is not corruption. It's something more sophisticated. It's the private sector drafting the social contract of the AI age and presenting it as a public good. The last time a single industry had this much influence over American infrastructure policy, it was the railroad barons of the 1860s. The government gave them land, rights of way, and subsidies. They built the railroads. They also built monopolies that took decades to dismantle. The question isn't whether America needs a new grid and a new social contract for the AI era. It does. The question is, who writes the terms? And if the answer is the companies that profit most from those terms, then what you're witnessing isn't policy, it's capture. And that should concern everyone, regardless of which side of the political spectrum you sit on. Think like a strategist. Subscribe to the Geo Brief.